We talk a lot about equal justice under the law, but what does that actually look like in practice? Do we have a two-tier justice system, or the laws truly applied equally, regardless of status? If you mishandle classified information at your job, your career is over. There's no years-long debate. There's no press conference explaining intent. There's no multi-cycle investigation that stretches past the moment. The rules are clear and the consequences are immediate. The same applies if you trade stocks using insider information. For ordinary investors, that's not a misunderstanding. That's prosecution. That's fines. That's prison. That's the end of your professional life. Now, hold that standard in your mind for a second, because when accountability reaches the highest level of power, the mechanics change. A clear illustration is the case of Hillary Clinton and the private email server controversy that became public in 2015. The facts were not ambiguous. A private server was used for official government business. Classified information passed through that system. Internal rules were violated. Investigations confirmed it. That wasn't speculation. That was formally acknowledged. What followed, however, was not immediate enforcement. It was years of investigation, hearings, public statements, internal reviews, and prosecutorial discretion. The process stretched across election cycles. It became political theater instead of procedural enforcement. And eventually, despite confirmed misconduct, the case closed without criminal charges. This is not about arguing what the final outcome should have been. It's about the structure of the response. For a lower-level employee, mishandling classified information and material triggers termination and often prosecutions, no question. At the highest level, though, it triggered delay, and delay is not neutral. Delay dilutes accountability. As months become years, urgency fades, public focus shifts, and by the time a decision is announced, the moment that demanded consequences has already passed. The same pattern appears within the US Congress when it comes to insider trading allegations. Members of Congress have, for decades, faced accusations of trading on non-public information gained through official briefings. After 2020, financial disclosures made certain trades highly visible, especially those that occurred just before major market moving announcements. For ordinary investors, this kind of conduct is aggressively prosecuted. Enforcement is swift. Penalties are severe. Inside Congress, enforcement has been rare. Investigations are limited. Ethics reviews are internal. Consequences are minimal or non-existent. The people writing the rules are largely responsible for enforcing them. And when oversight becomes self-policing, accountability becomes cautious by default. This is where the contrast becomes unavoidable. The higher the power, the softer the consequences. Not always in theory, but repeatedly in practice. To be fair, high-level cases are complex. They involve constitutional boundaries, classified material, national security implications, and political consequences that extend far beyond one individual. Decisions at that level can set precedent. They can destabilize institutions. They can reshape elections. So yes, more care is required. Due process matters. Precision matters. No serious system should rush major enforcement decisions just to satisfy public pressure. But here's where the tension begins. Complexity should make enforcement more careful, not slower to the point of paralysis. And yet, repeatedly, what we see is that complexity becomes insulation. Layers added, reviews multiply, jurisdictional questions expand, internal consultations stretch on, responsibility gets divided across agencies. And as each layer is added, momentum fades. Time becomes the quiet factor that changes everything. When enforcement is immediate, accountability feels real. When enforcement stretches across years, accountability begins to feel theoretical. Public attention shifts, political cycles reset. The urgency that existed at the beginning dissipates. By the time a conclusion is reached, the moment demanding consequences has already passed. And institutions, by nature, protect themselves, not because everyone inside them is corrupt, but because institutional survival is always part of the calculation. Agencies avoid destabilizing precedent. Legislatures hesitate to punish their own members. Prosecutors weigh political fallouts. Each decision is defensible on its own, but collectively, they create a pattern of hesitation. At lower levels, enforcement is rule-driven. At higher levels, enforcement becomes discretion-driven. That difference matters. When rules dominate, outcomes are predictable. When discretion dominates, outcomes become negotiable. And discretion bends more easily in the presence of power. Not because the law changes, but because interpretation does. Intent gets debated longer. Context receives more weight. Precedent becomes a shield instead of a guide. Over time, people notice the contrast. They may not follow every legal detail, but they understand speed versus delay. They understand immediate consequences versus extended review. They understand when enforcement feels automatic and when it feels cautious. And this is where the perception problem sets in. If a rule is serious enough to enforce decisively against ordinary citizens, it should be serious enough to enforce decisively against leaders. If negligence carries consequences at one level, it should carry consequences consistently. But when enforcement slows as responsibility increases, accountability begins to look conditional. And once that pattern repeats enough times, it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling structural. Now, brings us back down to ground level now, because this is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. For ordinary citizens, accountability isn't philosophical. It isn't political. It's procedural. If you violate a regulation, the consequences is usually predefined. If you mishandle sensitive information in a corporate or government job, termination is immediate. If you trade on insider knowledge in the private sector, enforcement doesn't pause to consider your status. Investigations move quickly. Charges follow, careers end. Most people experience the law through deadlines, audits, fines, and penalties. The system doesn't ask whether you meant well. It asks whether you complied. And when you don't, enforcement moves. Not dramatically, mechanically. And that mechanical nature is what gives it legitimacy. You may not like the outcome, but you understand how it happened. You understand the timeline. You understand the rule. There's clarity in that predictability. When you file paperwork late, the penalty doesn't wait for months of internal review. When you violate compliance standards in your profession, your license doesn't remain active while committees deliberate for years. When you cross a legal line, the system doesn't become hesitant because your position is important. It moves because the rule exists. What defines accountability at this level isn't harshness. It's certainty. You know the line, you know the consequence. And the system won't bend because you're influential. In fact, for most people, influence isn't even part of the equation. The rules apply impersonally, and that impersonality is what people have always associated with fairness. Now, contrast that experience with what we just discussed. When enforcement climbs the ladder, the language changes. At ground level, it's violation and penalty. At higher levels, it becomes review and process. At ground level, timelines are short. At higher levels, timelines expand. At ground level, consequences are predictable. At higher levels, outcomes become discretionary. That contrast is what people feel. Not because they expect perfection, not because they demand punishment in every case, but because they expect symmetry. If a rule is serious enough to enforce quickly against someone with no power, it should be serious enough to enforce consistently against someone with power. And when that symmetry breaks, even a little bit, it reshapes perception. Accountability begins to feel directional, following downward more easily than upward. Enforcement begins to feel automatic at the bottom and negotiable at the top. That perception doesn't require outrage to take hold. It only requires repetition. And when people see the same pattern enough times, fast consequences here, extended deliberation there, the issue stops being about a single case. It becomes about the structure itself. The long-term impact of this imbalance isn't outrage. It's withdrawal. People don't riot over procedural inconsistency. They adjust. They internalize the idea that rules are real, but selectively applied, that enforcement flows downward, not upward. And once that belief takes root, trust erodes quietly. The law stops feeling like a shared standard and starts feeling like a hierarchy. Compliance becomes driven by fear of penalty instead of belief in fairness. Civic participation weakens. Institutional credibility thins. This is how systems hollow out, not through explosion, but through erosion. Institutions continue operating. Laws continue passing. Enforcement continues at lower levels, but legitimacy fades when accountability appears conditional. This conversation isn't about punishment, and it isn't about politics. It's about symmetry, a system that demands immediate accountability from ordinary people cannot afford to treat power as an exception. The same urgency, transparency, and seriousness applied downward must apply upward, or the law becomes less about justice and more about permission. And let me leave you with this today. Accountability doesn't require perfection, but it does require consistency. And when people stop believing that the rules apply equally, the damage isn't loud or sudden. It's quiet, cumulative, and corrosive. Because when accountability stops at the top, people don't just question leaders. They question the system itself. And that's the American backdrop. This show is about clarity, not noise. It's about looking at what's actually happening in this country, not what we're told to believe. And it's about bringing back the values that keep a society strong: responsibility, honesty, and the courage to say what everyone else is whispering. And if you found value here, please subscribe to the channel and share with someone who thinks differently than you, or someone who's been asking the same quiet questions. Follow us on all socials, stay sharp, stay aware, and never apologize for using your own judgment in a world that keeps trying to replace it. See you in the next one.